looking forward to this very much, the commercialization module here. What I'm going to do is to introduce the co-moderators, and they in turn will welcome and introduce the other panelists. So we have Joe Cook Jr., who formerly was the chairman and CEO of Amylin and chairman of the board of Ironwood Pharmaceuticals. Before that, he was Group Vice President, Global Operations for Eli Lilly. So he knows a thing or two about bringing drugs to the market. We have Dennis Purcell. Dennis, do I see you? There you are. I see you. Dennis Purcell with Aisling Capital. I hold Dennis responsible for basically financing half the biotech industry in the 80s and 90s and aughts. And Ed Saltzman, who founded Defined Health, which is now known as Cello Health. And if I could get you three gentlemen live and turn it over to Joe, why don't you just, so that you have one person catching the mic, and please take it away.
Well, first of all, I'm looking forward to this because I hope to learn a lot. And one of the things as I get older is I realize how little I thought I knew, how little I thought was true. And now it turns out to be, well, things are changing. This is really an evolving time where science and consumers and commercialization efforts are really converging in an area that has heretofore had poor definition, at least in my judgment. And I think we're going to benefit from that by looking ahead. I've prepared a very brief slide deck to just sort of set the stage. I think each of the three of us are going to do that, if I understood correctly. So let me just kick this off. We started in 2013 with a company called Nucert, essentially taking some observations that had been made in a nutraceutical space, and we thought it would be great to explore repurposing existing pharmaceutical agents for improving metabolic dysfunctionality and an eye toward maybe having people live quality lives longer. And indeed, we were able to demonstrate through three very rigorously run IND-supported clinical trials useful benefits across a wide range. Next slide. And these included a number of conditions that are essentially associated with metabolic dysfunction, and now what we call metabesity, and maybe some new name was suggested earlier, all centered around what our approach is to take advantage of an observation that had been pretty well documented, that adding leucine to a variety of activating compounds in this energy management space would amplify the effect of the agents without necessarily a corresponding adverse event. And therefore, we were able to demonstrate in people with diabetes that by adding leucine to a low dose of metformin, we achieved the same glucose control as the full label dose of metformin. Then we turned our attention to liver because we thought if we can modulate glucose through improved insulin sensitivity, we might be able to alter the deposition of fat in the liver, and we studied it in NASH. And while the study didn't produce a primary outcome, we got a very strong secondary outcome. Those patients who entered who were in a sicker condition, as defined by sustained elevated liver enzymes, showed a remarkable reversal of liver fat. In and of itself, that probably would not stand as a unique observation because the liver has a pretty good job, can do a pretty good job of cleaning itself out. But in a comparative basis, we were able to amplify that. Then we studied the addition of leucine and a small dose of sildenafil in patients who were overweight, and we were able to demonstrate that we could show statistically significant weight loss compared to a control arm. So all of that led us to the notion that we had a utility function. Turns out, when we approached most pharmaceutical companies, they weren't interested. First of all, they weren't sure that the patents, even though we have composition of matter, would hold up. And second, they said, we are really only interested in new molecular entities. Repurposing old drugs and certainly adding a branched chain amino acid like leucine to them, how can that possibly be protected? We're not interested. Conversely, we started talking about the people at the other end of the spectrum. Next slide. Oh, I should have put this up. This is what we've been able to demonstrate in clinical trials. Statistically significant weight loss, glycemic control, and improved body composition. And in preclinical data, we have a number of factors that sort of support and underlie the overall theory that this addition of leucine is a really critical component. So now go to the next slide. So for the last 8 to 9 years, we've been raising money, conducting clinical trials, producing data, and we found that really in the right-hand side of the spectrum, the traditional pharma space is just not terribly interested in this. Even with data, they said, well, yeah, but you're really not going to build a brand, a franchise. We've also had conversations with folks on the left-hand side of this, and for the most part, they're really interested in optimizing their margins, their marketing margins, so they can spend more money on the promotion side. Very few are truly interested in developing a randomized controlled trial basis for natural products, and certainly not repurposed pharmaceutical products. So we've taken a slightly different approach, and we believe what we have observed is consistent with what we're seeing emerge, and that is in the middle category of this continuum of markets. We think the most likely and logical players, and boy, we're happy to have 2 representatives here today, are companies who come from another sector such as food or other elements of nutrition or maybe data, who have existing trusted brands who can introduce agents that will improve healthy aging using really strong science-based, we believe RCT is required, but build on the legacy of social capital they have with their consumers to build trusting products that can work in here. I mean, it's going to be very hard for pharma to drop down into this space. I don't think the margins are going to be at 90% COGS. And I also don't think that they're thinking about pivoting toward total wellness. They are more comfortable in developing medicines that deal with people's diseases for which characterizations can be made. Conversely, on the other end, I think most people are happy with just spending more money in marketing and driving it. So I see this as an emerging opportunity. This is where we've been as our conversation goes forward. You can take slides now. Over to you, Ed.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great. Well, first of all, thanks, Joe. And just to correct one thing, I don't have slides, and I don't believe Dennis does either, but we'll do our best to make up for that. Some of you may be relieved to hear that we don't have slides. So in any case, I just want to again thank the organizers. This is a long but fascinating and incredibly productive and intellectually just mind-bending conference. And I've been privileged to be able to sit on a panel on Monday and attend a few of the sessions. Not nearly as many as I've wanted to. Looking forward to being able to hear some of the recordings. It's just what you people put together. The team that puts this conference together works harder than any conference organizer I've ever worked with. So just a shout out to everybody. You know who you are. Joe, thanks for your opening remarks. I wasn't planning to say this, but it occurred to me that you know something about pharma's resistance and unwillingness to embrace innovation in some forms, because there was some point at which pharma wasn't particularly interested in another injectable approach to type 2 diabetes, right? You know, and I'm sure you remember those days well. It was going to be insulin or bust, right? And Joe, and Thomas mentioned in in his bio, is one of the founders or the founder of Amylin, and former CEO. So we can change pharma's perceptions, but I think some of the things that Joe laid out, will form the basis of our conversation. We have a lot of different representatives on the panel here. In sort of prepping for this, and one of the things I realize now, after a year and a half of doing virtual meetings, is that at physical meetings where you actually go in person, remember those days? There was a dais and you could only fit 5 or 6 people on a dais. So, unfortunately with these virtual meetings, we could put 20 people on the Zoom call. And in fact, we have, but the advantage of this is that, as long as we have enough time, and I think we do, although I know it'll go fast, we get this great diversity of perspectives. And because this field is still at a point where I think the diversity of perspectives is really critical and really vital, and this big tent, and because we're trying to break those silos, as we talked about over the first couple of days, if you want to bust silos, this is a great way to do it. So very different perspectives. I will tell you that my own experience and my background comes heavily from what, if I was to divide this field in terms of regulated versus unregulated space. So, pharma, diagnostics, medical devices, regulated interventions versus the unregulated space. Foods, and I'm not saying necessarily functional foods have a level of regulation. Antonio just nodded his head, and certainly it's not without regulation, but without the extremely heavy of burden of regulation, which infects everything about the business, right? More importantly, perhaps, or more significantly to the business model challenge, reimbursed versus non-reimbursed, okay? We haven't spent a lot of time in this meeting in talking about reimbursement versus non-reimbursement. There is a lot of speculation that goes on that, at some point or maybe we won't have to justify value here for our interventions. Maybe just the idea of having healthy longevity is so painfully obvious as to how much money you'll save. But I'm here to tell you a poor cold dose of reality that from the value and access side, that's just not true, okay? Everything, just like it'll be for the FDA in the regulated space, will have to be proven. And in the unregulated space or less regulated space, where there may not be reimbursement, there will still be a substantial burden of proof on claims. I'm really hope we'll have a chance to talk about this and drill in a little bit, because there hasn't been that much coverage at the meeting on these value metrics, on how we value. I think one of the things that I see behind the scenes is a lot of, well, who wouldn't want this intervention? Of course. But the question is not who wouldn't want it, it's who is going to pay for it, okay? And in the US medical system, particularly, who is going to reap the rewards, okay? And what are the benefits and what are the challenges of proving value? We fundamentally use two measures of value for pharmaceutical interventions right now globally, right? They're QALY, Quality Adjustable Life Year, and DALY, Disability Adjusted Life Year. I won't get into the various different, calculations behind those, but, it may be something that the field has to contend with, that those measures are not going to reflect the value of some of the interventions we've been talking about over the past couple of days. So I just want to center that point. And the last comment I would make before turning it over to Dennis is that I think, the title of this is business models, right? I spent my whole career wrestling with business models. So I'm going to repeat a observation I made on the regulation panel on the first day. And that is that I think the challenge we're dealing with, whether it be regulatory, commercial, value access, whatever it be, is that we're in a world in which the biology is moving faster. We're getting more innovation in biology than we are in business models, okay? For a long time, that was inverted. For a long time, the business models of big pharma, for instance, were legion. Pfizer was so incredibly admired, maybe not by the public, but certainly by investors and by multiple stakeholders in how well they played that business model game, okay? But the models are different now. The biology is different. The complexity of the interventions are different. We've moved from fundamentally a phenotypic approach to therapies to a genotypic approach to therapies. That makes a big difference. It makes a huge difference. And so my perspective here will be pharma. I know that pharma and biotech and investment, and I know that there's a lot of other representation on the panel, and hopefully we'll bring that forth as well. And I think in terms of any sort of opening or setting the stage, that's pretty much where I would leave you. Looking forward to the conversation. Dennis?
Great. Thanks, Ed. Thanks for the organizers for inviting me. I was going to take just a few minutes and talk about the industry from a financial investor perspective. I don't think we've had much of that yet. And to me, it boils down to two questions. Is there the money out there to fund the industry, and will it invest in this space? I come from more of a traditional life sciences or biotech background, where the people that funded us, or so-called limited partners, were generally the state pension funds or university endowments. And, state pension funds, a number of them are unfunded, have a lot of unfunded liabilities. The university endowments, because of COVID, are struggling, a number of them. So what they're trying to do is kind of just beat the indexes, beat the returns they get from stocks and bonds. So they invest in real estate or timber or hedge funds or venture capital. And, their expectation is that you're taking a lot of risk and therefore we want a commensurate return. They don't have the time frame that necessarily going to make them good investors for this industry. Because of their own problems, they're trying to get capital back faster than maybe this industry is going to be able to give it to them. I'll get back to that in 1 second. But the industry itself, life science industry itself, the last few years have been great, and COVID has just taken interest in the industry to a whole new level. But in traditional life sciences, if I have a cardiovascular, or if I have a rheumatoid arthritis company, I may not care if I really have cardiovascular disease, or I don't care about a rare disease company if really what I'm worried about is diabetes. COVID changed all that. Now everybody cares about life sciences. If it affected us all, and the dollars really flowed freely into the sector like we've never seen before. There's been all kinds of records. You name it, amount of capital raised, the number of IPOs, the size of the IPOs, the number of new companies started, you name it, it was a record this year. And there's an argument to be made that it's gotten out of hand a bit. Some of these companies have gone public at valuations that are $500 million with just a little bit of animal data. And that we used to never see that before. So there is a question about whether we're generally in a big bubble. But at the same time, funds are being raised to invest in life sciences generally pretty regularly. And the question would be, why are people still pouring money into the companies? And I think it's all, and this is kind of this where I want to drive home here today. I think it's all about returning the capital to the investors. It's about exits. And we've had a wonderful exit environment the last couple of years. You exit as an investor, you get your money back to your investors either through doing an offering, an IPO, or a merger or acquisition. And we've seen plenty of both. And that's kept investors really interested in continuing to fund at least the biotech industry. But we have an additional element here which should bode pretty well for the MedObesity or longevity industry. And that is, over the last couple of years, family offices and high net worth individuals have really piled into the sector. They have longer timelines. They're more patient capital. And there's a lot of them, both in the United States and around the world. And these are new investors other than the traditional VCs, of which I guess we're one of them, that really dominated the industry for a long time. Now it's these family offices that have different goals than the state pension funds and the universities' endowments. There is still a question about this new capital and tons of this new capital available, whether they'll stay if in fact the biotech industry or life sciences industry has a severe downturn, which some people think we might because of the valuations today. We'll see that. But I guess this is all a long-winded way of saying, if somebody invests $1 in me and I can give them back $2, the capital will be there. And the capital will be there for this industry if I can do that. So with that, how about if we turn it over to Jerry?
Jerry, you're muted.
No, thanks, Dennis. It's great to be here. It's a tremendous conference, my first one. And boy, it gets us ever more excited about the path forward. My background, I think that'll help sort of reference my points of view. I've spent over 30 years in the industry, started in big pharma at Merck for over a decade, progressively moved to smaller companies, including early stage startups, and was thrilled to join Life Biosciences earlier this year. The science is incredible. The potential here to change the world is incredible. And just thrilled to be a part of it. We are a mission-driven company. And I'll get into a little bit why I think, sort of from a commercial strategy, what we're doing is on point. But I thought I would just touch a little more on what was mentioned about the history of commercialization in pharma, at least from my experience, having been with big and small. There was a time before time in 1990 when I started where there was our marginal, our willingness to spend and pay for a marginal unit of incremental healthcare benefit was unlimited, right? Pricing inelastic. For years, I never saw, and I questioned, we would take price increases, and I said, this has to drive down demand. And because I was an economics major, and I was proven wrong year after year after year. And this went on throughout the 1990s. And defining innovation was a very loose term. I can remember it was considered innovative if you took a product that was 3 times a day down to twice a day. And it was reimbursed and lauded as something great. But I think what we've seen over time is continually this requirement in terms of marginal benefit for marginal unit of cost or willingness to pay has changed dramatically. It's a brand new world in which we're living right now. And the commercialization strategies and go-to-market strategies are very different. There was a time when I was at Merck and we were competing heavily against Pfizer. Pfizer had a strategy when they were launching a product. They would study the market, and whenever anyone else was doing the highest spend, they would increase that by at least 20%. So it became an arms race. I was on the launch team for Vioxx, and we kept running returns on investment on adding additional sales forces. We ended up close to 6,000 sales representatives marketing one product. That's ridiculous, right? We look back on it, and that was ridiculous. But there was a payoff because the market was willing to bear it. But over time, we've seen an increased power, and rightly so in some cases, of the payer, and asking the tough questions about what value do you bring. I will comment that I think sometimes there's not so much concern about the benefit, but just cost. But the reality is there's been consolidation on the payer side and lots of power there. So it's really like that toughest professor you've ever had. You hate it, but it makes you stronger and better. And I think it's making our industry stronger and better. It's forcing us to innovate. It's forcing us to think not just about a commercial strategy in terms of sales and marketing, but a value strategy. And when does that start? There was a time when that started post phase 3. You would have your data and then you think, what is our value proposition? Thinking about your payer strategy was in a whole separate building at Merck, and you sort of just added it onto your marketing strategy. But over time and now, you shouldn't really start a company until you understand what your value strategy and your value proposition is. And you should build your plans, your programs, make the tough choices around that. So when I think about commercialization strategy, I think about it from inception. We're a preclinical stage company, and we ask ourselves the tough questions every day. Do we have great science, right? It starts there, because without great science, you can't create value. And do we have the intellectual property? Our businesses, our industry is built on intellectual property. I've learned that over time, moving from an innovative company like Merck to repurposed drugs. And we heard a lot of that earlier. There's a real challenge on reimbursement and also interest among big pharma. And then the question comes down, we often, if we're lucky enough, we have platforms today. And at Life Biosciences, we have the riches of having 3 large platforms that have multiple potential opportunities in this space in the aging biology, but making tough choices about what indications we should pursue. And understanding, we need to do a better job of understanding the competitive landscape now and in the future, because as was mentioned earlier, things are moving faster. The biology is moving faster. Competitive environments are moving faster. The time of exclusivity, even for an innovator, is decreasing all the time. There was a time when if you were the first in class, you had a 5, 6, or 7 year head start on everyone. That's now under 3 years. So it puts a lot of pressure on your commercialization strategy. So you constantly have to ask yourself through having a profile, which we call target product profile, throughout the development, requires discipline to know when to kill, right? If you start heading down a wrong road, the longer you head down that long road, the longer and more expensive and time consuming, and the opportunity cost is greater of getting back on track. So you have to build that discipline into your commercialization strategy at an early stage. Also, I think over time, the external stakeholder group has changed tremendously, and the focus. There was a time we focused on key opinion leaders and prescribers, and probably that's about it. Now, we really need to understand the patient advocacy groups and their journey before we really can understand how to bring value. And then very early, it's understanding the payer journey. And once again, not thinking about that as an add-on, but from the very early days. And so before you even get to the prescriber, as I hate to say it, but today the prescriber has less involvement and less control over what is used and what's going to be put in the patient's mouth, right, or injected into them. And so it's really working that journey that's important. And the other thing I think from a commercialization strategy that we can talk about today here is life cycle planning. And what I mean by life cycle planning is really mapping out the future of your company. And you can do that by platform, by product. There are opportunities from return on investment to build a franchise within a molecule. And then as I think about, and as we're wrestling with it, right, we're a mission-driven company at Life Biosciences. We believe in extending healthy lifespan. That's why we're in this business. That's what we do every day at Life Biosciences. We realize that that's not the first step. And then what we're working on is how do we get there, right? What is our commercialization strategy and our development strategy that's going to allow us to get there? And in the previous session, we heard a lot about biomarkers and scales and clocks. And for my worth, we need to think about that now, right? We're in preclinical. We need to think about that. And how do we work with experts in the field, like folks who've been on this involved in the conference, and how do we work with the FDA so that we can shorten that gap, right? I think it's unrealistic today to think that we're going to get an aging claim right out of the gate. We're going to target age-related biology, treat a disease, but what evidence can we create prior to that first approval that can expedite and give us a better probability of getting an expanded claim? And then that becomes attractive to investors, right? To partners. In essence, it gives them a free option, right? If you can treat a disease state where there's significant unmet need and have advantage over everything else in the market today and get to market, there's value there, right? There's real value and novel science. And beyond that, though, if you're bridging this gap and shortening the gap to a broader mission to longevity and health span, I think it's the way to go. And I think it gets us there faster because I just don't think we can get there right away. And then finally, we get this question a lot about when is Big Pharma? When are they coming? They're sitting on the sidelines. When are the ships coming across, right? And we're going to see them on the horizon. Well, I can tell you with a fact, they're there. They're looking, they're scouting, they're watching, they're reading the papers. They're paying attention. I know firsthand, right? We have folks who are in touch with us all the time. Big Pharma acts in their own way, having been there. They'll measure twice and cut once, right? They'll take a long time, but once they make a decision, they will move very, very fast. And so I think they're intrigued, but it's a little bit out of the box of the standard plan of a disease, an indication, a standard regulatory pathway. And I think they're understanding how do they value that and where do they want to place their bets. So I'll stop there, probably more than you wanted, but it's a lot that we think about every day.
The only thing I would say, I just want to say before we turn it over to the next presenter, Jerry, is that it's really, really interesting to listen to you. Some of these things, that we and I personally have been preaching for many, many years, and hearing it from the inside of your perspective was really, really refreshing. There really isn't enough, and it's not a criticism of this conference because, I think this conference is, I gave my feelings about it before, but I think this idea about how we are going to, regardless of whether this is a pharmacologic intervention, a medical device, a diagnostic, a biomarker, an app, how are we going to define and prove value? Okay, is going to be really, really important. And then value, of course, is value received by a multiplicity of stakeholders. Right. And the value differs by stakeholders. And, as just mentioned in the chat, it differs by system and payer and structure. So, but that is just we spend a lot of time on the regulatory side of things, talking about it, and as we should, and we need to. We spend a lot of time talking about biomarkers, as we should, and we need to. But we need to bring front and center into this conversation the way that we're going to claim and prove value for all the interventions that we're talking about that are going to support, healthy longevity. Because I think there's a lot of perception out there that that's an automatic. And I'm here to say that it absolutely is not an automatic. Okay, so who's next? We have to call you can make us call on people. Okay, I'm gonna call on Antonio because he's closest on my screen.
Yeah, I was unmuting myself.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody, and again, thank you for the invitation and for having me. Look, it feels like coming to the yearly conversation on healthy aging with a very good group of friends, and it's interrupted only by time, but not by intention. So it's a very good feeling. And one other comment I would make before going to a few slides, just to set the stage from our point of view, is how intertwined this space is. Imagine that the person that brought me to PepsiCo 3 years ago from pharma is currently Jerry's chairman, so Dr. Mahmood Khan. So it's really a very intricate group of people that are all intending to move this space forward in the best way possible and from different points of view. So let me offer mine, which is going to be in continuity of the conversations we have had in now 3 previous versions of coming together as this group of friends and experts. So if I can have my slides, just a few key points. The next one, please. So as you can imagine, CPG companies and PepsiCo at that look at consumer trends very intently. But we also look, and my team at PepsiCo, which is called Life Sciences, by the way, has that as the primary goal. We also look at large science and technology trends. And these are 2 that we have landed on because of their magnitude and their timeliness. And certainly the one, we can have a lot of discussion on personalization. That's perhaps for another day. But the one where we have stopped having arguments inside the PepsiCo organization is how timeless is healthy aging. And we have stopped having those conversations because we see the convergence of multiple organizations looking at this. I've listed a few in the left portion of the slide, but also because of the reflection that given the epidemiology of healthy aging, this is going to create a tsunami, which in our terms translates into a large marketplace. So the question becomes not to discuss anymore whether this is an opportunity or not, but how you access it. And there are 2 things that you have to do from our point of view to access that. One is to reflect on whether or not you have an offering to bring to that marketplace. So certainly in our case, products, but also an idea of how you talk to that segment of consumers, which is easier said than done because people don't like to be told that they're old. There is an interesting concept of, biological age versus chronological age. Is that a way of moving the needle of the conversation a little bit more? And one of the insights that we learned in this past year is that when you talk about biological age, that conversation is of interest to a much wider age range that we had anticipated, and possibly even more interesting to younger people than it is to older people. Now, if I can have the next slide, I keep going back to this one. It's an outdated slide, but it becomes more and more current and relevant every year I go back to it. which is an argument I think Jerry and others and Ed and Dennis and Joe have already made this point, which is one of what is the economic argument here. And if you want to deploy a solution at scale for healthy aging or improving health span, this, even with my experience, in fact, I was even at Merck, Jerry, for 2 years. So we may have overlapped at some point in our careers. So this is, if you want to deploy a solution at scale, it cannot be, I don't think, high tech, high cost. It has to be low tech, low cost to have an impact of the magnitude where you touch as many people as you can. Now, there is my opportunity as the chief medical officer at PepsiCo is to sit on an organization that puts a products of our portfolio in the hands and mouths of consumer 1 billion, 1.5 billion times every 24 hours. So that's the scale of the denominator that I can access through this position by advising my leadership to go in this direction. And it's obviously a great responsibility and a great privilege, but it's also a massive opportunity. And when you think along those lines, next slide, and you start thinking, people are going to have to make choice between food or medicine. We think that the solution that you bring into this marketplace of healthy aging has to deal with the 3 A's: affordability, accessibility, and acceptability. I'll make it immediately the point that when you talk about food and even food as medicine, we have to be very careful because people don't identify food as a prescribable intervention. In fact, even the nomenclature of intervention is somewhat problematic when you talk about food. Food is something that you go to because it makes you feel good, it tastes good, it's comforting, it's part of your culture, it's available all the time, possibly at a very low price point, and every time you need it. So let's keep that in the back of our mind, because here the parameter changes a little bit when you move from prescription to food and beverage solutions. So next slide. Then, talking about basic things that have the potential of have a large impact. And I suspect you will hear this as well from Philip at Nestle, what these large corporations are doing with their portfolio, recognizing this massive epidemiological trends, is a multi-year, in fact, multi-decade effort to make their portfolio and ours as well. And I have a few examples here, more permissible by reducing the impact in our product portfolio of certain nutrients, such as sugar reductions, sodium reductions, and using healthier oils to prepare our products. And it's very contemporary, in fact, as of today, that the FDA has come out with new guidance for a recommendation on how to reduce salt in the majority of the food categories here in the US. So that will create another level playing field where the food and beverage companies will compete to best position their products in that landscape. And now when you reduce sugar, salt, and you improve your oils on portfolio or products that reach a large number of people, that is bound to have an impact on health and therefore on longevity. And so just continuing to do this might be the lowest possible denominator of what a solution for this problem looks like. But we've gone beyond that. We will continue diligently and transparently to execute on our product portfolio evolution and renovation. But as I said in previous occasions, and I repeat now, we want to go beyond this. So if you can give me the next slide, I'm almost done. We have, in fact, started to look deeper at the science of healthy aging. And in fact, we've even created a process that didn't exist in the company before, which goes in our lingo by the name of R&D Innovation Dossier, where we have, when we consult with worldwide experts, try to understand the biology of what food and beverage might contribute to in terms of improving health, and then go and look for potential solutions. And I'm giving you an example of where we are. We have basically in 2020, between 2020 and 2021, produced 6 of this R&D Innovation Dossier. The first one to the left, this little blue square, is the one dedicated to healthy aging, and then 5 that are adjacent to the problem of healthy aging. We have scoured the palette of ingredients, technologies, identified partners. You can see the number of advisory boards that we have had, the experts that we have consulted, and the scope of the geography of where we're looking for potential solutions. And in doing so, next slide, and then it's next to the last one. Obviously, we have reviewed the domains, the physiological domains of the changes that occur with aging. Nothing earth-shaking here. It's just an acknowledgement that there are certain changes that happen to physiology and how food and beverage can impact some of this physiology. And by simply doing that, then we have overlapped this with our current portfolio without creating new products, and realize that we have a lot of offerings already that could be offered in support of some of this physiological changes. So here becomes more of an issue of how you reposition your portfolio for people to understand that that could be an applications of products that exist already. And then the further step, which comes closer to Jerry's world, is next slide, is to look really at the fundamental understanding of the molecular underpinnings for longer health span, and to go into the deep science of how that science could drive product portfolio evolution. And here this brings us into the space of functional foods and functional beverages, where you fortify your products with ingredients that are likely at the doses that you are allowed to introduce in food and beverage applications to have an impact on some of these biological pathways. And this might seem a little bit, food and beverage sci-fi, but it's not. There are companies, and Dennis was probably referring to some of those, that are fully dedicated to discover the relationship between nutrients and health in a very pharma-like way, and producing packages that would be very comparable to how you would proceed for a new drug development in pharma, with clinical data from preclinical in animal clinical studies all the way to phase 3 and phase 4 studies. And again, Philip from Nestle may refer to some of those companies that both Nestle and our company are looking at. Will this become a platform for us? Most likely, given the size of the marketplace that is created by the opportunity. So we have moved from discussion to execution mode. Evidently, I cannot go into the details of what has been worked on at this point, but the promise is one of eventually bringing proof points to the marketplace in the not so distant future, and not only in the US, but also in other countries. For us, the East is very interesting from this point of view. In those cultures, the question is not if food can be considered as medicine. In those cultures, food is medicine as we speak. And so there is really a massive opportunity in Asia and Southeast Asia specifically. I believe this is my last slide. There is probably one concluding slide just to say that the opportunity for us is very huge. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it on to, I believe, Philip at this point.
Thank you, Antonio. Can you hear me? Great. So thank you, Antonio. I think that was the perfect introduction. And you know, Nestle and PepsiCo are two global companies. So a lot of the things that you just said, I had planned to say almost in an identical way. But maybe just a few points to reiterate. So Nestle is global. It's the biggest food and beverage company in the world. So if we think about healthy aging, we have to think at a global scale, which also means aging is very different already culturally. And you just picked up on this, you know, in some cultures, you know, think of traditional Chinese medicine, you know, here food is part of you know, our health. And then you have the other extreme, maybe in the US, where the healthcare system is so expensive that food is also considered as medicine, but more the supplement space, because people want to take care of their own health before seeing a doctor just because it's very expensive. So in this sense, as a global company, we cover the full spectrum. And so here we have similar pillars as what Antonio just presented. So, you know, if you start with the global food and beverage pillar, here it's all about diversity. You know, we want to promote diversity for consumers, micronutrient-rich foods. And then the second pillar is still in the food space. So the intention of, let's say, the products is still to feed people, but it's a great way also to provide micronutrients. If you think of iron fortification, I think we sell 200 million doses of iron fortification every day as part of soups and so on. And for some areas in the world, this really counts. You know, this is part of health. And then there's, of course, the third pillar, where the food that you sell is really intended in a way to support people in their health. And then you get into the healthcare space. And I will get to this because this will be the focus of what I want to talk about today. But maybe I start with something a little bit provocative, and is saying that maybe Nestle pioneered aging research. And so this goes back to the early 2000s, actually, in our pet care business. And I'm not sure a lot of you know this, but we have a pet care business. And they published in the early 2000s that caloric restriction extends health span and lifespan in dogs. And there was a 14-year-long study. So this started when I was 6 years old. And this is really the era before what we today consider as the modern aging research. And so until today, it's the only higher mammalian example of extended health and lifespan via caloric restriction. And so pet care, they built on these findings, and they commercialized, you know, again, like years and years and years ago, long before Metabesity, you know, got into the spotlight as a conference. They started commercializing senior dog and senior cat diets, and they work. I mean, they work great. You know, if you think, you know, well, there are clinical studies, but also the consumer feedback we get to the point where dogs regain cognitive capacities in the way they play and so on. So maybe this is just, you know, here in brackets a bit the positive note. You know, I think aging research works, and aging research is commercialized and in a productive way. So. But, you know, maybe now I shift back to human, because this is probably where most people here in the audience are interested. And so let me just switch quickly now to our healthcare business. So it's called Nestle Health Science. So within, so it's a whole, you know, food business, but dedicated to supporting health of people. And here also we span quite a range. So Nestle Health Science is today the biggest VMS provider, meaning vitamin, mineral, and supplement provider in the world. It's roughly half of the business. And then Nestle has a very strong presence in the medical food space, food for special medical purposes, oral nutritional supplements. And here, so for example, in terms of the medical nutrition, you can think of medically supervised, very low caloric diets for weight loss. or also nutrition for critically ill in intensive care units. So these are just 2 examples. But if we now shift a bit to the portfolio for healthy aging, so there's first what I would call the more traditional portfolio, which is looking at people 65 and plus, and especially those that are at risk of frailty, potentially even at risk of malnutrition. So there are great products out there, with protein supplementation, micronutrient supplementation, but it's a bit of a traditional view on aging. So when we think of the old, the frail person, and I think Antonio said this beautifully, aging is just not the older segment. It goes really into a young segment, and it gets younger and younger. And if you go to areas like the Silicon Valley, it starts with young software engineers thinking of healthy aging. So, I think it's hard to put a limit on this. So what we really wanted to do then is say, there's so much cool aging research and so much evidence now about fundamental pathways of aging, that we need to go one step further than the traditional products for frail and older people. And where we thought as a nutrition company where we should play is mitochondria, just because mitochondria are the central hubs that integrate what we eat with the energy output that we need for everything we do. And there's so much evidence that mitochondria decline with age. And so we gave it a step, and I will quickly share my screen. I just have one slide just to give you a bit of an idea how this looks like. Let me see if this is, do you see the presentation already? Yeah, great.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. So what we launched, and this was very exciting, that was last year in October in the US, it's a new brand called Celltrient. And essentially the focus of this brand is to build on the strongest academic research in mitochondria research. And we have 3 Celltrient products on the market today. From the top right, you see our cellular energy product with nicotinamide riboside, which is an NAD+ precursor, very fundamental process for cellular energy production. A lot of evidence that NAD is getting consumed at a much higher rate with aging and in many medical conditions. Then in the middle, Celltrient Strength, which builds on urolithin A. It's the first marketed autophagy inducer, so for cellular renewal, turning over mitochondria. And later on in the company session, you will have Amacentis speaking, Anurag Singh, who's really among the drivers of the science behind urolithin A. So we partner here with Amacentis. Forgot to say for nicotinamide riboside, we partner with Chromadex in the US. And then at the bottom, it's Celltrient Protect, which is a high dose of 2 amino acids of N-acetylcysteine and glycine to boost our oxidative stress response and other pathways related to mitochondria. And then just on the left, just to illustrate in one example the way we bring mitochondria, research to products and then to consumer language. So here it's really trying to explain to consumers and patients how important mitochondria are as power plants in the cell to power muscle, but also other tissues, and really bring the full extent of the science to the consumers to have them be able to access these products for their health management. So, and this is where I've finished for now, but very happy to later go into the discussions on our concepts of commercialization around healthy aging and all the way to medical products.
Thank you. I'm going to get to see if the full screen will come back.
Let me try to see how I exit here.
There we go.
Great, thank you.
That works good. So I'm told, and Thomas just sent me a chat that James, who was only able to join us for a limited window, has to leave at 5. So I'm going to go to you, James, next. I'm sorry you missed the opening, but why don't we let you express a few thoughts?
Sure. I know I'm coming, in medias res here. And so perhaps it would be better. I mean, obviously, I can just say a couple of words on my view on this topic of like how we're going to commercialize things in the geroscience space. Mention a little bit of what we're doing at Cambrian, but I don't want to monopolize the discussion or distract us too much. So maybe I'll try to make 3 quick points. The first is that whenever I see anyone approaching this space, we have a bunch of people who've been thinking about this topic for quite a while on this call here. I think that there are a series of different definitions right now for what the longevity biotech space, if we want to call it that, even is. And I think that I tend to want to start these discussions with, pinning down that definition of what this space is doing. And I tend to focus a little bit more narrowly than some of the stuff that Philip was just talking about, which I think is absolutely part of the field. But Cambrian's focus is entirely on FDA-regulated therapeutics that will be ultimately used for prevention. So this class of drugs that we call geroprotectors, things that can extend the healthy lifespan of animals, but then the specific subclass of animals, including humans, and then the specific subclass of those that are going to be FDA approved in the same way that, Lipitor is approved to prevent diseases of aging. And in the case of these geroprotectors, it'll be multiple diseases of aging. And that kind of circumscribes what I think of as this longevity biotech space. So that's kind of point 1. That's how I define what the space is. And then once we've defined it, then we can kind of talk about what in my view, the key challenge of this space is. So if you go back 5 years, I think the key challenge of this field was finding its legs for an investment thesis at all, right? There were so many programs, and I'm sure a lot of us knew about them or took part in them, that had figured out some interesting piece of fundamental biology, extended lifespan of a mouse using that piece of fundamental biology, and then said, hey, we want to set up a biotech company around this. Set up a biotech company, maybe even got some funding, but then hit a wall at some point in determining what they were going to do to really build a clinical program that could achieve around that topic. And I think that the field as a whole has moved past that. Because we've come up with this idea that I refer to, like, everyone has their own name for it, but I call it stepping stone indications, right? Figuring out which disease indication in the here and now can be targeted with this interesting insight into the fundamental biology that also happens to slow down aging, and building a biotech company around just that piece. And so I think that the industry, as it's gearing up now, and what's going to be commercialized out of this field is not so much geroprotectors, things that will slow aging, as drugs for diseases X, Y, and Z that have the potential to slow aging, but are going to be approved for diseases X, Y, and Z. And so it's an industry of drugs that are created from insights into the biology of aging. And there's going to be a pivot point sometime in the future. My guess is it's going to be towards the end of this decade, where we stop being an industry around insights into the aging field and start being an industry that's commercializing things that are actually going to be slowing aging. And I think that's kind of the fulcrum point for this whole field taking off. And my view is that fulcrum point is going to be defined by the FDA's acceptance of the first surrogate endpoint-based clinical trials. Because the problem with running a prevention clinical trial right now, I mentioned the statins before, is that you can't run a short trial. Therefore, no serious biotech outfit is signing up to run a prevention trial for multiple diseases. And so by having a surrogate endpoint, getting the okay to run a 3-year trial instead of a 10 or a 15-year trial, that's where I think you're going to get a lot of players, including us, entering this space. So those are my couple quick points on how I view this field and how I see it evolving. And then I'll close very quickly by mentioning what Cambrian is and what we do. So Cambrian is a biotech company that has been working with academic researchers all over the world to create a whole family of subsidiaries, each with an individual collection of assets around a particular hypothesis, something that extends life in an animal model, but has an application against disease X. And so we have 14 of these different programs in development right now, ranging across modalities from small molecules to biologics, to even a really interesting cell therapy program. And so we've now built an internal research and development team that's brought a series of drugs to the clinic and beyond onto market before, to help shepherd those academic discoveries through the drug development process, and are making really, I don't want to make this a talk about Cambrian, but are making really interesting progress. So we're sending the first probably 3 to 5 programs into the clinic within the next 18 months, all of which have are NCEs with the potential to be human geroprotectors, but will be going into the clinic for one of these stepping stones, right? Rare disease, oncology, metabolic disease, whatever it is in the first case. And so I'll stop talking there and participate back in the discussion. But again, sorry I joined late, and hopefully those are some useful thoughts as we kickstart things.
Very much, James, thanks. So we go to Casey next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's been wonderful to hear everyone's thoughts so far. So my name is Casey Means. I'm the co-founder and chief medical officer of Levels. I am a medical doctor and surgeon by training, and my work really is focused both medically and entrepreneurially on scaling consumer tools that promote foundational health by helping people understand their own bodies so they can make better health decisions around food and lifestyle. So the Levels program does this through a metabolic awareness program where people track their blood sugar continuously with a prescription wearable device, a biosensor called a continuous glucose monitor. And our members learn through our software layer how food and lifestyle choices are affecting their glucose in real time. So really closing the feedback loop between what you put on your fork and what's actually happening in your body, so that you can personalize choices to optimize well-being, optimize longevity, and minimize chronic disease risk by stabilizing blood sugar. So just an example of this to kind of make it concrete, someone may have been told by their doctor that oatmeal is a heart-healthy food for them and they should eat it for breakfast. Then they eat that while wearing a continuous glucose monitor and using Levels, and they might find that it actually spikes their glucose 80 milligrams per deciliter from their baseline, which is extremely high. And then it comes crashing down. And that crash for them seems to always coincide with when they feel sluggish in the mid-morning and they have that post-meal slump and need a second cup of coffee. And so the sort of Levels program would help them understand how to design a better breakfast that minimizes that damaging glycemic variability, those ups and down swings that we know are independently associated with premature mortality, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, et cetera. Whether that's adding more fat and fiber and protein to their oatmeal or switching to something completely different with fewer carbohydrates like free-range eggs and sauteed greens and avocado that does not spike their blood sugar. So Levels is early stage. We raised $12 million seed round by Andreessen Horowitz last year. And we're currently in a closed beta program. We have about 15,000 people who have gone through the beta program and about 150,000 people on our wait list. And it's a membership-based model. It's direct to consumer. So really outside the healthcare system at this point. And involves a yearly membership fee of $199 that gets people access to the Levels ecosystem, which is a telehealth consultation for these prescription biosensors, at cost continuous glucose monitors shipped from a pharmacy to their door, as well as other metabolic health tools like direct-to-consumer lab panels to help further understand your own metabolic health, and then of course access to the Levels software and education. And our mission really is to reverse the metabolic crisis, which is in many ways a longevity crisis as well, since metabolic diseases underlie so much of premature mortality. And we're doing this by expanding direct-to-consumer access to personal health data so that people can really understand for the first time how food and lifestyle is affecting their bodies. Originally, continuous glucose monitors that our members get are FDA approved for type 2, individuals with type 2 and type 1 diabetes. So they're intended for people with diabetes. And what Levels represents and caters to is an emerging, really strong consumer interest in utilizing these FDA-approved tools for a much broader population to give people this opportunity to manage their metabolic biomarkers more closely before the emergence of disease. So moving away from the reactive sick care sort of model of we only can monitor and track these things once we have a fulminant illness to what if we actually monitor these throughout the course of our lifetime and never reached that diagnostic threshold for disease. We know that the physiology that leads to type 2 diabetes starts well over a decade before your fasting glucose actually reaches diagnostic parameters. So understanding those glucose swings and glycemic variability early can be really a leg up in terms of not moving down that metabolic disease spectrum. I'm sure everyone on this call is aware that, the metabolic crisis is monumental. 88% of American adults with at least one biomarker of metabolic dysfunction. 9 of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States are in some way tied to blood sugar. This contributes to everything from Alzheimer's disease, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, depression, Alzheimer's, infertility, erectile dysfunction, gout. The list goes on and on. So creating scalable digital solutions to improve this is absolutely critical to really meaningfully improve longevity and chronic disease on a large scale in Americans. If we don't get blood sugar under control, like all the extra stuff is really icing on the cake, but this is like very foundational. And I think especially going back to sort of the conversation around value in the healthcare system, I really do believe that tools that help people improve their metabolic biomarkers, understand them, optimize them, are going to emerge as massively high value, given that high blood sugar is the root cause underlying most of the chronic illnesses in the US. And, it's estimated that 90% of our healthcare costs, $4 trillion healthcare costs, are related to chronic disease. So the data still needs to be shown whether these tools used preventatively really do generate that value. But I think philosophically and sort of logically, we would see that happening if these tools can really shift behavior. We believe that it's going to come down to behavior change over anything else. Pharma or healthcare interventions. Foundationally, it's going to come down to behavior change. I, as a physician, believe that you can't really fix the cellular biology of meta-obesity or aging without changing what people put on their forks and what they eat day in and day out every single day. And I think that biosensors like continuous glucose monitors and the emerging biosensors that are coming online right now, CGMs are the only biosensor available, meaning real-time tracking of lab data at home on body. But that's going to change over the next 5 years. Absolutely. We're going to see multi-molecule sensors. A lot's going to be coming down the pipeline in that. And I think that this is going to be really, really helpful in terms of the behavior change that is foundational for improving the cellular biology of meta-obesity. We are expecting to see that as this consumer market expands, it's going to lead to some really interesting shifts in the healthcare and food industry. I think we're going to see some bottom-up shift in consumer decision-making as people have more awareness of how things are affecting their health. And we see large populations getting results about how food products are affecting their bodies. That's going to create a totally new world of demand for products that don't have that impact on their bodies. And I think that's going to actually create some really positive shifts for promoting healthy products and a more preventative approach in both the food and healthcare system. We're partnered and deeply embedded in the academic space and the longevity space with our advisors, including Dr. David Sinclair, Gerald Shulman at Yale, Robert Lustig at UCSF, David Perlmutter, Mark Hyman, several others. And so, happy to answer any questions about Levels or sort of the biosensors and the impact on longevity as the conversation goes on.
Thanks, Casey. It's an extraordinary perspective. Appreciate it. And Roman, you've been waiting very, very patiently. So last but definitely not least, we'll turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm very humbled to be featured on this panel. I've been following the conference. I'm only sorry that I didn't carve out enough time to see all the sessions, but phenomenal conference so far. To introduce myself, I'm Roman Kalista. I'm also trained as a medical doctor, but my background is also in data science, more specifically deep reinforcement learning. That's kind of where our product lies as well. So what we did, we looked at the problem from maybe a little different perspective. Instead of increasing the health span, we are trying to kind of lift the bottom up. So we focus on the very difficult unengaged patient. So we looked at the claims data with our payers end up actually spending on each patient groups. And it's interesting just to see that the Pareto principle works everywhere, and especially with health plan members. And we know that about 50% of healthcare costs for each payer are incurred by about 5% of their member population. So we look at that problem, and we try to analyze, how can we reduce those costs, because we know that CMS is going bankrupt pretty soon. We need to do something about our most expensive patients. So we specifically look at metabolic diseases, diabetes, uncontrolled hypertension, etc. And we looked at interventions that work. And surprisingly, of course, the best intervention is the number one listed in most clinical guidelines. It's the dietary change and exercise, right? So we looked at options to actually make diet prescribable. We discussed dietary prescription, right? And we know it's extremely difficult. So we thought that there wasn't any innovation for a while. So with RxDiet, we focused on solving the problem of prescribing diet to this very risky population, usually called unengaged. So we know that these patients are very difficult to reach. They're very difficult to convince to do anything, and especially change their diet and lifestyle, right? But we also know that if we manage to do that, there are very significant healthcare savings to be realized by the payer. So we know that these patients cost on average $60,000. And if we focus on specific groups, we're somewhere in hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient. And we know that there are interventions that work really well. So an example of which would be a concept called food pharmacy, where these patients would simply receive a voucher from their provider, and they would visit a local food pharmacy that will be set up by their local hospital, and they could pick up free food, and they would have a conversation with a dietitian. And this simple concept works amazingly well. So we know that, for example, Geisinger with their fresh food pharmacy in Pennsylvania, they've managed to save about 80% of healthcare costs for the patients participating in their food pharmacy. And the ROI on these patients calculated by Geisinger was about 80x, which is, of course, very, very appetizing to a health plan. But there are two major problems with setting up a food pharmacy. They're very local. You can usually reach people in about 10-mile radius, and they're very problematic or expensive to set up. Did I freeze for a minute?
You're on now.
Oh, okay, perfect. So yeah, there are two major problems. As I mentioned, they're very expensive to set up. So they're high startup costs, and they're almost impossible to scale. So those were the two issues that we tried to solve with RxDiet. So we spoke to people running food pharmacies. They told us, oh yeah, we've spent about $2 million setting up our food pharmacy. We had to come up with an entire supply chain for our produce. We had to hire 6 people full-time to manage the pharmacy. And we're now able to service about 30 people per year, right? So that's not cost effective, and that's not something that will work very well long-term. And that's not something that will be positive ROI to a health plan. And then there's the problem with scalability. If you can only reach the patients in a 10-mile radius from the hospital, you'll probably not capture all of your problematic patients. There will be maybe 5, right? So we looked at this problem, and we came up with a solution that surprisingly works. We've looked at the most efficient way to distribute food nationwide. And of course, the existing retailers do their job very well. So Walmart can reach 90% of US population with a pickup option. And they've been phenomenal in terms of course, supply chain, and that their cost of food is extremely low. and even their cost of delivery with prescriptions, they can deliver food to your house for $2.50, right? So this is unbeatable. And the second point was the actual cost of food, and we came up to a very interesting mathematical problem, because to actually design a personalized meal plan to a person, a set of grocery products that you can give that person that is medically tailored to their condition, it is designed according to their taste and preferences, but also is very cost effective, is actually a very complex mathematical problem. So the number of permutations is extremely high. The complexity of the problem is about 72 factorial in our case, as we've designed it. And it takes about 3 years to solve with a 16-core server machine, right? So we were surprised, there's not a simple way to solve it. But we've looked at deep learning solutions, just recently published. DeepMind has made great progress in this space. And surprisingly, these algorithms are pretty good at solving strategic games and strategic approaches to solving different problems, such as chess, a game of Go, etc. So we've designed the meal planning problem as a game for the algorithm to solve. And suddenly we've been able to solve the large state space of 72 factorial, not in 3 years, but in about 5 minutes. So that allowed us to build these patient meal plans and deliver them at the lowest possible cost in any given location in the United States. So we currently have custom integrations with Walmart's, Kroger's, FreshDirect in New York City, Amazon Fresh, and we're now able to offer a product to a payer that is zero cost to start, compared to a food pharmacy. We can start immediately. We can start with 5 patients. We can start with 5,000 patients. It doesn't matter much to us in terms of technology. We're able to deliver automatically food to any of their patients. And the model that we're proposing to payers is that you pay for patient food. You take the risk on the food, and we will take the risk on the services provided with our care team, with our technology license. And after we realize the cost savings for the patient, we will have a shared savings contract to generate revenue per each successful patient. And we know that if we focus on the right patient population, the savings can be upwards of $40,000. So this is a very simple model that of course value-based contracts are not simple at all, but from the initial meeting we can start with a health plan by paying $3 per meal and design a very simple pilot, which we figured out was instrumental to getting anywhere with a health plan. So we're now approaching any organization that is bearing risk for the patient. So it could be self-insured employer, it could be managed care health plan, it could be at-risk providers, such as the new models that we're seeing these days. And these organizations are surprisingly very interested in food, because they now have the data. In year 2021, they finally have the data, and they see that food insecurity and metabolic conditions associated with that are a major problem for them, and they cost a lot of money. So this is kind of the model that we run with RxDiet. To talk to our stage, we're a seed stage company. We're currently raising our seed round, to be precise, and we're ready to answer any questions.
Thanks. I was just texting or chatting with the co-moderators here. I just sent a note asking Joe if he wanted to take the first question, pose the first question, because this is a big tent with a tremendous amount of perspective. So I would just thank everybody for presenting them. I guess maybe one quick logical way to start, and I'll turn it over to my co-moderators, is, and the chat's been very lively here, by the way, lots of comments, questions, suggestions going on, a lot relating to the difficulty of inducing and accomplishing behavioral change. This has been tried before, and these kinds of things. I'm probably not representing these comments fairly, but just in the interest of time, sort of summarizing them. And now we're bringing modern tools today's tools and very advanced tools towards hopefully modulating and incentivizing the right behavior, whether it be diet, exercise, and whatever needs to be done. I guess the question I have is as usual, is the one that looks into the future and says, we've got a variety of approaches represented on this panel, right? We've got big food. We don't have big pharma, but Jerry has certainly spoken eloquently for big pharma, probably even more honestly now that he's out of big pharma. So I really appreciate, and we definitely appreciated all those perspectives. Dennis has spoken about the investment environment and the fact that some of the things that Dennis and I talk about all the time, that regardless of the space of healthy longevity, the conventional name brand life science investors have not, embraced this space. And finally, I'll just make one observational comment, which I failed to do before. I think it's important. If my eyes run over the registration list correctly, I still don't think this year we have very much, if any, large pharma attendance. Regardless of whether we're pursuing innovation on the technology side, regardless of whether we're pursuing innovation on the food side or on the pharmaceutical side, I think it may sound like a harsh innovation, and it's probably more directional than 100% accurate, but large companies, I can only speak for large pharma companies, haven't done a tremendous job of innovating, over the last couple of decades. For that, we have an industry called biotech. Right. And biotech has led and has driven innovation. If you look at it in terms of the pharmaceutical environment, you will note that, outside of small molecules, every major therapeutic platform has been innovated outside of large pharma. Okay. Whether they be recombinant proteins, protein therapeutics, monoclonal antibodies, now the various different CAR T therapeutics, they've all been innovated outside of large pharma. So, I guess the question, there's two items for discussion, and I'll invite my co-moderators to jump in. One, is this a big enough opportunity for everybody? Defining this commercial space is a huge challenge, as James sort of, set that out, I think, in first. Even defining one subsegment of this field isn't easy. Do we even need to bother? Is there enough opportunity for everyone? And how does this shake out? How do we seize this opportunity? Do large companies, one of the things that I'm intrigued by, and maybe I'll pose this as the question, do you folks see that large pharma companies ever really get out of the regulated space as I defined it before? Because history shows that when they've done it in the past, it hasn't worked out well. Okay. They've been into medical devices. They've been into, over the counter, which are mainly RX to OTC switches. They've certainly been into in cosmetics, and they've been in some cases into foods and functional foods, and it hasn't turned out well. In most cases, they destroyed value, in the companies that they acquired. So start with how you think the proponents of drugs for diseases are going to embrace this space, or how they're going to approach this space, and then how do they interface with today's tools and the tools that the fascinating, tools and platform that, for instance, you have, Casey, and you have, Roman. All right. So I'll throw that out as a general discussion point and ask my moderators to refine that or ask a completely different question.
So I'll comment. Can you hear me okay? So I was with Lilly for 28 years, during which time we purchased Elizabeth Arden and subsequently sold it. We purchased 12 device and diagnostic and intervention companies and ultimately spun that out. We purchased a medical benefits group and subsequently that was spun out. We purchased a packaging company because we thought it would be great to be vertically integrated. That was a bad idea. We still had a printing company because we thought, well, you can better control the accuracy of your label by making sure the printing plates are printed in-house. All of those things, when in retrospect, for the 28 years I was there, and we had a home lawn and garden fertilizer company, we had agrochemicals, we have animal health, we had food production. We had a pretty good smorgasbord of ideas. Absolutely no improvement in valuation when you're multiplied on the market value process of a 90% COGS. If your gross margin is 90%, and that's the multiple group you live in the marketplace, your shareholders are not going to tolerate the fact that you may be the leading home lawn garden producer of fertilizer, which we were next to Scott's, but our margins were 8%. And so in my executive training, I got the benefit of running the worldwide capsule business, $150 million a year in revenue, and we made 0.5% profit. And my job was to figure out a way to get out of that. So we sold it to Shionogi in return for a license on a number of technologies that they couldn't develop, all of which got the multiple. I think it's going to be a very hard hill for pharmaceutical companies to digress from that margin evaluation calculation. That's why I said in my opening slide, I think the more logical players are those who either consumer packaged goods companies or data science companies, or perhaps biotech, if it's got long enough investment horizons, can go after that middle sector. I think a bigger problem, Ed, and the one I was going to ask everybody to comment on, I think we're operating in a culture today where there has been a substantial erosion of trust on almost every meaningful institution that we used to hold up and say we can count on it. The number of variable outputs that have come out of our governments about whether to wear a mask or not, or at what pace one should be vaccinated, admittedly, we didn't know, but the commentaries have really eroded a lot of people's trust. So who do you trust? And I think, Teresa and I made the comment, I think you're going to have to go back to a position of trying to establish that trusting relationship with consumers or customers you already have and extend what franchise you do have and build on that basis. I don't think large pharma is going to, they may accept it later on if the margins get better, but I don't think they're going to intentionally move in that direction. They may explore it for curiosity, but I don't think they'll do it long term.
I see a couple of hands up, virtual hands up. So I'll go to James first and then go to Phil.
Sure. I was just going to weigh in to, I think, disagree with Joe's perspective a little bit there on how pharma can play in this space. I think everything that you're saying about the misadventures of moving into all of these new areas is absolutely spot on. But I think something that I spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about is that this new world of medicines for promoting health span, at least in my, as I defined before, that like limited view of the therapeutic side of things, it's going to look an awful lot like traditional biotech companies. And we've had actually quite a lot of interest from traditional pharma investors who want to take bites at the apple of our different programs. We're even in talks to bring some programs that have this really interesting biological activity related to aging out of big pharmaceutical companies to house them into biotechs, because they don't quite know what they want to do with that asset, and we think we do. And so the way that I think that these are going to mature is not so different from how the explosion of oncology and rare disease companies are maturing right now. And you touched on something that I think is absolutely the key point for this piece, which is in order to nail that health span promise of these medicines, you need to have an institution that's going to be extremely long-term and dedicated to that mission. And so I suspect, at least the way that we're pursuing it at Cambrian, is that we're not looking to like sell off asset by asset to the Pfizers or Mercks of the world. We're looking to do long-term commercialization partnerships with them.
I think that's a big difference. And I actually agree with you. I think so long as you don't look to pharma to be the exit path,
yep,
I think there's an important strategy. And investors, like Dennis said earlier, we are seeing a lot more high net worth individual and family offices investing. We actually have a venture firm, and we have no institutional money in our fund. We're on our third fund. And the reason for it is high net worth individuals will take a longer term view. Most of them want to accumulate wealth over a decade, not flipping it for next year's tuition reimbursement subsidies called scholarships. So they're really driven off of the basic notion that maybe they can actually do some good and do well.
Yep. So Philip, I'm sorry, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I want to pick up on the term unregulated versus regulated, because I think in the end it's not black and white and there's no pharma and other stuff, because and you alluded to this at the beginning. So it's always about the intention of use. If you sell a broccoli to someone to feed someone with broccoli because it's nutritious, you can do this. But you cannot say, I sell you the broccoli to treat, cure, or mitigate your disease, right? Because then the intention of use is to treat, cure, mitigate, and then it's a pharmaceutical. So if you want to do this with broccoli, you have to file an IND and you have to do a pharma pipeline all the way to phase 3, right? So, and where you are in between is, and it's exactly the same if you do now a broccoli extract, rich in sulforaphane. It's the same if you want to treat, it's pharma. If you want to say, lowers your risk for, then it's a supplement. If you just feed someone broccoli, it's a food, right? So, and then the question is, how do we use now this framework to, on one hand, bring credibility to the consumers, a longevity or anti-aging product that really helps them without having to say it's a pharmaceutical, right? And maybe the real world example here is omega-3, right? You can buy your omega-3 in a pharmacy for whatever purpose that you want, anti-inflammatory and so on. But the moment, and this is what Amarin did, the moment where you want to say it treats hyperlipidemia and reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease, then it's a pharmaceutical. It's omega-3 can become a pharmaceutical. And then you have a different return of investment model. So the question is now, do we want to go in this field of healthy longevity all the way to mega trials that cost $100 million to be able to say treats aging, which today is not even possible from a policy perspective, or do we build the evidence otherwise? And I think the future here is that some supplements will make it because they have the credibility, and you have to build the credibility with the healthcare professionals because those are the ones that recommend. And today, we often get the feedback from medical doctors that they don't even know what supplement really to recommend because they essentially they tell their patients just buy something that's the cheapest because then it's a good quality, but I can not tell you more. So in the end, it's about the credibility. And then if you think from a perspective of fast-moving consumer good company, aging becomes so important. Today, look at Nestle. We have a huge portfolio for the first 5 years of life, baby formulas and so on. The reality is we have more people over 65 than children under 5. Mm-hmm. And even the elderly or the older adults, they move into e-commerce. And in e-commerce, you have very different ways to bring information to the consumer. So in the end, it will come down to credibility, information, and how to bring it, and not, I think, in my point, whether it's a pharmaceutical or a nutraceutical or something else.
Mm. So I'm gonna, Jerry, I think you had your hand up. I'm going to come to you in a minute if that's okay, because I just want to stay on one theme that's bouncing around in my head. I think it was on Monday, I was on a panel and I said, the difference that this field, and let's define the field as the Big Tent, right? Healthy longevity, geroscience, whatever we want to call it, with all the various different, interventions. The challenge that this field, I think, faces that's probably unique to this, let's call it, therapeutic area, showing you my pharma thinking, but is that we know we have ample evidence that the first line of therapeutic intervention should be prevention. Okay. And that exercise works, diet works. Okay. To some of Casey's points, we know that perhaps having that big meal of oatmeal in the morning, while it's heart healthy, okay, as it says on the label, is actually sparking, a glycemic attack. And it's not, so we know a lot of these things. And yet, the failures, as I think some people have been pointing out in the chat, of an ability to ensure, we'll use the term compliance or adherence with this advice is universally pretty poor. Okay, so it seems to me that in one sense, Casey, the platform that you're pursuing and you're developing, and Roman, actually the platform that you guys have, and then actually, Antonio and Philip, sort of the approaches that Large Food, if we can call it for that for now, are taking, to put better ingredients, better products into consumers' hands so that they will more willingly comply with the advice. Perhaps that is not the same, because perhaps what that is a threat to pharma, which right now, as of today, until it changes, is set up and wholly staffed to treat disease, right? So there is actually the clear separation between disease prevention, okay, and disease treatment, chronic disease treatment, before we start to talk about, how much is there for pharma to move into, right, to sort of go back a little bit to the, and Joe, thank you for that great answer to the question in terms of the history lesson. But again, I also, to some extent, agree with James that this might be a slightly different dynamic that we're dealing with right now, right? So I think I just make that as a comment and maybe in the form of a question. Are these competitive, initiatives, or Casey, for instance, do you see, or Roman, do you see you guys aligning with a pharma company? Roman, you mentioned outcomes-based contracts, particularly hot subject in pharma these days. Most pharma companies don't want to enter into outcomes-based contracts because either they can't measure the outcome or they don't perceive that they're going to do very well. Do you change that game? So there's a lot of just, thoughts and questions for discussions, and I'll call on the people with hands up, I think in the order they presented. First of all, Jerry, did you want to make a comment because you had a hand up and it went down? So
no, it just had to do with these adjacent technologies. I think what you've seen, if you look at big pharma, it's just what Joe had said. At the end of the day, it's a drop in the ocean, right, compared to their large revenue generating franchises. However, you are seeing investments in adjacent technologies, and I think what Casey is doing, it could align very nicely, right? As an investment, adjacent technology investment that supports an overall franchise. And so I think the mindset is not that this is a threat, right? I think these issues are so big, the metabolic issues are so big. There is an interest into advancing technology in order to support the treatment of patients, right? And I think there's very little feeling that it's a threat.
Casey.
Thanks. I love those comments, Ed. And I think I just wanted to comment on a few things. I think the first one is just really the poor results we've maybe seen with large scale behavior change tactics, and whether that is, a bad sign for these technologies, like what we're talking about with Levels and others. And I think sort of just some historical sort of thoughts on that. So first of all, in the 90s, when we changed, the food pyramids and we said, okay, we're going to really lean into 6 to 11 servings of carbs and grains per day and decrease fat. And we saw the food industry really sort of move in that direction. People actually did it. I mean, people started eating more carbohydrates and less fat. And we saw a resurgence of obesity, diabetes, and other illnesses related to this metabolic dysfunction and glycemic dysfunction. So people, I think we don't give people enough credit for actually doing what people say and recommend. And unfortunately, that advice was poor. And it led to the situation which we're in now, which is where 70% of food in the grocery store has added sugar. Because we had to replace the fat with something, and the sequelae of that. So I am hopeful for, if we really get on track with really large scale, sort of more policy and perspective from the healthcare industry on a really rational nutritional approach, that it will trickle down and people will, that people can shift, and the food industry can shift, because we've seen that happen already once. Also on behavior change, I think something we're seeing now that we've just never, ever had before is the closed loop biofeedback on nutrition that sensors and wearables and these new technologies, direct to consumer lab testing, can do. we eat about a metric ton of food per year and multiple pounds of food per day. It's a lot. And to draw conclusions about, oh, this aspect of my diet is the thing I need to shift to have really a large gain, we've never had that possible. And the idea that we would go to the doctor, they'd say our fasting glucose is up by 5 points since last year. How in the world do you track that back to particular components? You've eaten thousands of things that year and make a change, when in fact, a lot of the times it's very, and we're seeing this in our members, very select amount of things in the diet that are the bombs that are causing the problem that you can adjust really easily. So that closed loop biofeedback, I think actually can have a massive, really quick and efficient shift on behavior and creating the one-to-one relationship between food and outcome. And I think something interesting that James was talking about earlier was about how, this is a little separate from this, but how clinical trials for longevity and whatnot, they're going to have to show earlier biomarkers that you can find differences in within a few years as opposed to 10 or 15 years. But the more we can shorten that to like minutes or hours, like seeing biometrics change rapidly and then compound over time as a proxy for sort of long-term clinical outcomes, I think that's really positive. And we now have the ability to do that. So, so I'm very hopeful for the behavior change side. In terms of the question of whether a company like ours would see itself aligning with, you know, the pharmaceutical industry, that's certainly not in our roadmap. I think, like someone else was mentioning, these are such massive issues. Like we are going to have to come at this from all different sides to it's the biggest health issue of history, the metabolic crisis. And so our leaning will always be towards the more holistic behavior approaches. However, with that said, this type of tool and platform can be very valuable for people in the supplement and the pharmaceutical space, because you can start to see clinical outcomes biomarker based outcomes much faster in a more nuanced way. There's a company called Pendulum Therapeutics, which is a Akkermansia probiotic that's been clinically shown in trials to reduce hemoglobin A1C in people with diabetes. You know, obviously they're very interested in continuous glucose monitoring because you can really show with much more granularity the effect of a product like that. So while our approach is always going to be foundationally based on the behavior change component, there's certainly ways in which this type of technology can empower better outcomes data and research for people in the supplement and pharma space.
Thanks, Casey. Roman, you have your hand up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think, you know, food, lifestyle, exercise, and pharma will always be complementary to a successful treatment. And we're hearing a lot about diabetes reversal and remission these days. And, you know, just from reading all the studies, it's fairly possible in someone who's been diagnosed 2 years ago, but in someone who's had diabetes for 30, 40 years and has permanent changes, it's not really realistic to expect completely reversal. And, you know, I think there's always space for collaboration with pharma. In our program, we stabilize patients' blood sugar within 2 to 3 weeks. That's the goal for the 2 to 3 weeks. And we use medication, of course, and diet and exercise to get to that point. And then we can work on stable, sustainable weight loss and potentially de-prescribing some of the medications that are unnecessary. But, you know, to expect full reversal from everyone and to, you know, maybe live without medication completely, I don't think it's realistic in majority of chronic conditions, and drugs are here to stay. But yeah, the second point I wanted to make is that we're seeing regulation regarding food as well. And, you know, for example, in California, from January 1st, 2022, food is a covered option for Medicaid recipients. So Medicaid health plans can now prescribe food to their patients in lieu of services, reimburse food for Medicaid patients in lieu of services, and can count it towards their capitation for the next year. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a huge regulatory change happening, especially with the new administration. The SNAP budgets are increasing, and we're seeing a lot of investments in food. I just wish that you know, maybe the subsidies that the corn industry was benefiting from for a very long time would kind of shift towards produce and more fiber-rich ingredients. rather than the processed starches. And I think there's a lot of things wrong with the food system as it currently operates. And just shifting that along, maybe kind of changing the public perception a lot could move a needle significantly.
Right. We have so many virtual hands up. So Antonio, your virtual hand is in the upper left corner of my screen. It was invisible to me until Thomas pointed it out. So I apologize, but I see it now, and please, the floor is yours.
No problem. Just a couple of thoughts, perhaps a little bit provocative, and I've already disclosed that I come from a long tradition in pharma, and then I end up in food and beverage. So I want to agree with Casey on the fact that biofeedback is probably going to be one of the unlocks here. The challenge with that, and I'm sure Casey will agree, is how do you democratize it if you want to deploy it at scale? Again, I think this discussion might diverge in terms of solution, is whether these are niche applications that go to a certain portion of the population, perhaps falling back into the trap of the sickest, the most needy, the one that consume the most resources, or whether we're talking about deploying solutions at scale that would benefit the majority of us, because people aging, and hopefully aging in a healthy way, is people looking like us. I mean, it's, you don't have to go very far to find your target population other than this wonderful panel of experts. And that's where, as somebody who has lived 2/3 of, in fact, 4/5 of his career in pharma, I've been humbled by coming into food and beverage, into the thought that when you try to deliver an application through that lens, this hyper medicalization of the problem works against you. So people don't eat science. People eat good tasting foods that they like and they have liked for a long, long time. So first of all, you cannot take your consumer and jerk them in a different direction overnight. You have to be part of that journey and accompany that journey. But the point that I want to make is that when you look at it through that lens, I think the biggest blind spot is that we think of health and fun as two opposite things. And I'll share with you guys an experience that we have had recently within PepsiCo, where we took the same line of products, one aimed at the general population and the other one with more functional messaging associated with it. And we looked at the packaging. And the packaging of the portion of the portfolio that was not conveying a functional message was very brilliant, very into your face, very colorful. And then we ourselves, when we moved to wanting to deliver a more functional ingredient message, we toned down the color. It looks very gray. All of a sudden, it feels like it's contrived. And so all the fun is gone. And I think this idea that health and fun cannot coexist is a major blind spot. And my thought-provoking message to this panel is that if we were able to hide health behind fun, probably we would be much more successful.
So let me, Joe, I see your hand is up in the upper left-hand corner. And just in terms of the time remaining, I do have one question I want to ask we have two investors on the official investors on the call, and I might leave it with them, but let me go to you, Joe. You're one of the investors, by the way. So
yeah, I'm sort of wearing a lot of hats. I hope, Casey, we're successful at doing it with biofeedback. That would be a dream. I struggled mightily when we were trying to develop medicine for people with diabetes to get them first to agree that we could help them live a more normal life. Unfortunately, the recommendations of diet and exercise were listened to by 10% or less, and they stuck for maybe a month or 2 or 3, and then people reverted. What I was more interested in is trying to figure out a way to activate the 80 plus million people in the United States who have some degree of demonstrated insulin resistance or glucose dysfunction. To me, that was the curve that I thought we could tip. We spent a lot of time trying to psychologically alter their attitudes. People don't want to be classified as sick. When they prefer not to be called a diabetic person, they are a person with diabetes. And we got into this psychology, and quite frankly, we got to a point we were just trying to get people to be motivated to live a better quality. I think, Antonio, I just want to say, I really do think if we could hide health behind fun, and maybe we can do it by making the biofeedback loop fun, or making the food that's delivered to your homes more fun, something that takes it out of the you're sick and I'm going to tell you how to live a better life, to I'm going to help you enjoy life and live it in a flourishing way. And by the way, you will probably enjoy more life. That to me seems to be an integrated view of how to tie these together. End of comment.
Mm-hmm. Great. So given it a few minutes left, I just want to ask, Dennis, and Joe, I know you said you have many hats. Dennis, to the best of my knowledge, you still wear one primary hat, which is the investor hat, and you've worn it for a really long time. You and I we've kicked around this field, sometimes after another terrific MetaBesity conference, Dennis reaches out and says, what did you think? And I say, I'm more interested in what you thought. So I'm kind of just interested in Dennis, your thoughts about, as you listen to all of this, where are the investable opportunities here that get you excited? And how do you see those rolling out? Do you think this space is broadly ready for prime time? Do you see some of the traditional life sciences VCs who, we've pointed out actually are sitting on an enormous amount of capital? Do you see them coming in to embrace this field? What's your perspective?
Yeah, James made the point about investable thesis, mm-hmm. that there was not one 10 years ago. I'm not convinced that I could articulate a good one right now. Mm-hmm. In biotech, there's a lot of investable thesis. I invest early stage companies. I invest in late stage companies. I invest in oncology companies. I invest in rare disease companies. And so everybody kind of has something that they specialize in. And as it happens, 10 years ago, say, I don't think anybody would have predicted that 90% of all venture capital dollars would have gone to cancer and rare diseases, or mm-hmm. 95%. So I understand things can change, and when they change, they may change on a dime. Very quickly. So I understand that. As we try to raise money from limited partners or talk to family offices or high net worth individuals, I have to be relatively succinct and clear about what the thesis is. Why should I invest with you? I talked a little bit before about exits. How am I going to get my money back? Is what they want to know. How am I going to get my money back plus some? And so I think that we're going to see an investable industry when we start to have some line of sight toward the public markets accepting this as some type of industry. We still have to define it, I think, but the public markets accepting it, or the merger market accepting it, or something, because people won't invest in the industry if it's just an open-ended invest and this is cool and it's going to take forever before it'll pay off, but it's a big deal and it's a big industry and all that kind of stuff. That's where we started with biotech, and really a thing that concern is that after we did have a line of sight on biotech with the Genentech IPO, first IPO that happened, and Genentech, who's now part of Roche, they went public and nobody ever heard of biotech before. This was 1981, and they priced the deal at $15 a share, and within 2 hours it was trading at $85 a share, and nobody had ever seen that before. Nobody knew what biotech was. Nobody knew how to pronounce Genentech's name, and nobody's seen anything like it. So all of a sudden, it sprung onto the scene. But then what happened then was over the next decade, like 5 to 10 years, a bunch of companies got started that ended up to really be science projects. And we went into the late 80s and early 90s with kind of a bunch of new companies and stuff like that, but they weren't really sustainable. They weren't really built for the long term. They should have still been in academia. So I think that we have to have a line of sight on, are companies sustainable? What are some options that they can do to get the money back? And how do we succinctly, like we do in biotech, explain what the investable thesis was? And just to end up on that, Ed, this sounds kind of goofy now, but when we started, the entire venture industry was early stage venture guys. And we just said, we're going to be late stage. We're going to invest in phase 2 or phase 3. And they said, well, venture guys don't do that. And, I made the observation that all companies don't have a straight line. They all fail in one way or another. They all come back to earth, and they all need more money. And that's where we want to play. And that was the thesis that kind of sold reasonably well for a number of years. And now everybody's doing it. But it was clear. It was succinct. I could explain it on one page. And it was different. So I think that's what we need to do.
One of the things it makes me think when you're listening to you, Dennis, and these are remarkable lessons of history. It's the fact that pharma turned on a dime. Pharma, I don't actually think pharma is capable of turning on a dime, and it probably didn't. But in terms of relative pharma history, I agree with you. I think that and some of the things that Jerry mentioned much earlier in his, the payers actually did a favor to pharma by spurring pharma to innovate and take risks. And that pushed pharma to capitalize biotech and investors to capitalize biotech because they knew pharma would have to eventually take on that innovation, albeit when the risk was taken out. And so some of the reward could flow to the investors in those, risk companies, right? But it did turn, right? It did turn. And in fact, paradoxically, we have a whole pharma industry that's focused on actually sicker people, people with extraordinarily rare monogenetic disorders, or people with advanced cancers, and none of this is to suggest that this isn't exactly what pharma should be doing. But it might not be the only thing that they should be doing, right? And to the way I observe it, it's the only thing that they're doing right now. So I think it can turn, okay? Because I think that what pharma has been doing for the last, several years, maybe more than that, maybe even close to a decade, the way the time seems to fly, is that it might not be sustainable. It probably likely isn't sustainable. Given so many of the things that we've talked about on this, this really fascinating panel today. Joe, I saw that you had your hand up. By the way, I apologize to my co-moderators. I didn't mean to seize the moderator role, but my type A personality hates silence. Okay, so if there was silence, I just decided I'll always be the one to jump in and fill it. So, but you guys are all remarkable. So I just want to thank everybody for the participation. And if anybody wants the last word that's not me, please take it.
I predict you'll see pharma pivot on a dime if they are forced to negotiate prices with Medicare.
keep
I'm not sure it'll be good for the R&D budget, but I guarantee you they will not be able to sustain the structures they now have.
Well, any catalyst that would make it could change it. So I now see Zan, him popped onto the screen, and Thomas. So I think that will relieve me of my responsibilities here and our responsibilities.
Well, not quite.
Thank you, panelists.
Well done, Ed. Well done.
Yeah, bravo, everybody. Just amazing, as always. And, bellissimo, Antonio. I love what you said. Separated by time, but not intent. I don't know. You should write a poem or something. I haven't heard that before, but I love it. It does express what we've been doing. We started with Joe and Ed in London in 2017, and then Antonio and Dennis and James joined us in 2019 in Washington. And now we have Casey, Jerry, and Philippe, and Roman. So it's a fraternity, a sorority. It's a fellowship that just keeps getting better. And we've got to keep this think tank going. I believe we can do that through the campus and other ways. But all to say, we've got a lot to do. And Ed, you're so right. We've got to address value proposition. That was sort of an epiphany that you gave me, that, we just assumed that anybody would want to take a product that seems like it would do good, but that we've got to guard our assumptions. So we can't thank you enough, and let's just keep at it.